that the success of the entire machine depends on something that costs only a few dollars, a simple rubber ring. On January 28, 1986, that's exactly what happened. Why is a rubber O-ring so important? Most of us think of rubber as something that's always soft and stretchy. Challenger disaster changed engineering forever. Choosing the right material isn't only about knowing what it's made of. It's also about Hello everyone, this is Ruhi here and welcome to Cross Section. So the idea behind this channel is that every object around us has a story hidden beneath its surface. And most of the time, guess what? We never notice it. But seriously, every crack, every failure, and even every breakthrough has a reason waiting to just be discovered. So at Cross Section, we go beneath the surface, not just to understand what happened, but to uncover why it happened. Because every failure leaves behind a lesson, and every story has another layer waiting to be revealed. So let's get started. Imagine spending billions of dollars building one of the most advanced machines ever created. A machine powered by powerful engines, designed by thousands of engineers, and built from millions of individual parts. And now imagine that the success of the entire machine and the mission in which it's being deployed depends on something that costs only a few dollars. What? And in this case, a simple rubber ring. Well, that sounds impossible. But on January 28, 1986, that's exactly what happened. Millions of people around the world watched as the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Florida. But just 73 seconds later, the shuttle broke apart in the sky. And unfortunately, all 7 astronauts on board lost their lives. So, this is food for thought. How could one tiny piece of rubber bring down one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements? Let's investigate. Well, when engineers first examined the disaster, many possibilities were considered. Had one of the main engines exploded? Had the enormous fuel tank failed? Was there a manufacturing defect? Or had something gone wrong during the launch? But the final answer surprised everyone. The investigation eventually traced the entire chain of events back to that one single component: a rubber O ring. If you know about rubber O rings, you might be quite surprised. But for those of you who don't, why is a rubber O ring so important? Well, getting a little technical here. The space shuttle used two massive solid rocket boosters to help lift it off the ground. You can see this in the picture. And each booster was so large that it had to be built in separate sections and assembled before the launch. Where two sections met, engineers placed a circular rubber seal called an O-ring. And if you think about it, its job was surprisingly simple. To get an intuitive understanding, think about the rubber gasket inside a pressure cooker or a water bottle cap. Its purpose is to squeeze into tiny gaps and stop anything from leaking out. And the O-ring did exactly the same thing, except instead of sealing water or steam, it had to seal gases hotter than 3000 degrees Celsius. But wait, rubber was actually an excellent choice. Why? Well, it's soft, it's flexible, it can change shape easily and press tightly against surrounding surfaces, creating an almost perfect seal. And for years, the system worked exactly as designed. But then came one unusually cold morning. Launch day was one of the coldest mornings in the history of the Space Shuttle program. In fact, ice had formed on parts of the launch pad overnight. Some engineers had already expressed concerns about launching in such low temperatures. But as the countdown continued, everything appeared normal. The shuttle lifted off, the engines roared, the boosters ignited, and nothing, absolutely nothing, looked unusual. But something very unusual was happening inside one of the booster joints. Now, most of us think of rubber as something that's always soft and stretchy. But you've probably experienced something different without even realizing it, if you've done this before. So if you've not, leave a rubber band in a freezer for a while. And when you take it out, simple change. It feels much stiffer than before. But we know that, obviously, it hasn't turned into a different material. It's still rubber. But it no longer behaves the same way. And that's exactly what happened on Challenger. The cold weather made the O-ring much less flexible. Normally, how this would work is this. The moment pressure built up inside the booster, you remember those structures, which, the up and down ones, the rubber would quickly squeeze into the tiny gaps and seal them shut. But this time, it reacted too slowly. And for a very brief moment after the launch, a tiny gap remained open. And in fact, that was the problem. Superheated gases escaped through that gap, and those gases began burning through the rubber seal. Eventually, the escaping flame reached the shuttle's external fuel tank, and within seconds, the vehicle broke apart. At first, many people thought the disaster had been caused by an explosion, but the investigation revealed something much more important. The rubber hadn't melted because it was weak. It had simply behaved differently because the temperature was different. A small change in material behavior was enough to begin a chain of events that ended in catastrophe. One of the most memorable moments of the investigation came months later. Physicist Richard Feynman wanted to show the world exactly what had happened. And instead of using complicated equations, he performed one simple experiment. He placed a piece of the same O-ring material into a glass of ice water. And after a short time, he squeezed it with a clamp. And then he released it. Instead of immediately springing back to its original shape, the rubber stayed flattened for several seconds. The entire demonstration lasted less than a minute, but it perfectly summed up the disaster. And everyone watching could immediately understand the problem. The material hadn't stopped being rubber. It had simply become too stiff to do its job quickly enough. The disaster highlighted one of the most important lessons in materials engineering. A material's properties are not fixed. The exact same rubber that worked perfectly on a warm day behaved very differently on a cold one. And again, the material hadn't changed, the environment had. The Challenger disaster changed engineering forever. Testing was no longer about asking, does this material work? Engineers also had to ask questions like, does it still work on the coldest day? Well, what about the hottest day? After years of aging? And under every condition it might actually experience. Because the key point is, a material that performs perfectly in the laboratory may behave very differently in the real world. The lesson wasn't that rubber is a poor engineering material. In fact, rubber seals are used in aircrafts, cars, spacecraft, medical devices, and countless everyday products. The real lesson was that the engineers hadn't chosen the wrong material. They had underestimated how much that material's behavior could change when the environment changed. Because in engineering, choosing the right material isn't only about knowing what it's made of, it's also about knowing how it behaves when the world around it changes. And that brings us to the end of this story. Was there something about the story that maybe surprised you? Or is there another engineering mystery you've always wanted to know about? Whatever it is, I'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section below. And remember, if you're someone who loves to understand or is trying to figure out the hidden science behind engineering, don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss out on the next episode of Cross Section. Looking forward to seeing you then.